Okay, so I hope y'all remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about Jesus' baptism and his temptation. And then last week we saw where Jesus started calling his disciples. And remember, we only saw a few. We saw where he called Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, John. And then we jumped ahead where he calls Matthew, because Matthew's not at the same spot. But today's lesson is another familiar one. And this is when I really wish you were here so I could ask, what you think about it, how you know the story. But we're going to be in John chapter 2 if you want to head there. And this is Jesus' first miracle where he turns the water into wine. So I know most of you probably know it, but I hope today you'll pay attention and you'll learn something new with it. And remember when we talked about last week, this is probably a little confusing, that the 5 disciples, Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, and John, that a couple of them had been with John the Baptist, and he pointed them to Jesus. And we saw them follow him some, but then later we see where Jesus comes along as they're fishing, and he says, "Come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men." So remember we talked about there was a time lapse in between, that John had pointed them, they followed him, probably at some point went back home, but we don't know when. And then Jesus calls them to full-time ministry to follow him. So this happens, the changing the water into wine, in between. And he only has the 5 now. He doesn't have Matthew with him. And they're heading to Cana for a wedding. And we think of weddings, we go to afternoon or evening, and you're there for a couple of hours. But in Jesus' day, a wedding was several days to usually about a week long. So that's what's going to play into our story today. So we're going to be in John chapter 2. First, we'll read verses 1 through 12. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind the Jews use for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out, take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink, but you saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he would reveal his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother, brothers, and disciples, and they stayed for a few days. Okay, so we're going back, and again, this is where I wish I could ask y'all questions. In the very first couple of words, it says, "on the 3rd day." So what would jump out to you when we say, "on the 3rd day"? I hope after just having Easter, you're thinking of that Jesus was raised on the 3rd day. The Bible never accidentally puts in references like this. You may also think about that on the 3rd day, we often talk about the sign of Jonah, that Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days. So when this jumps out, it's to make us think about that and point us toward that. And then we get to the part where it says Jesus, his mothers, and his disciples, they had been invited. We've often talked about in our class as we do prayer requests, we don't just do the big things of cancer, sickness, or things like that, that we've tried to tell y'all that God wants you to talk to him about everything. And sometimes we think of God only showing up or being concerned with the big areas of our life, the sin of our life or things. But here it tells us that Jesus had been invited, and he wants to be invited into all aspects of our life, to the fun things. He wants to be there for the celebrations. And with a wedding, I know several of you have sat through Lori's class, and so this should be jumping out to you too, that Jesus, he loves to use a wedding because we know we're the bride of Christ. And so it's no wonder his first miracle happens at a wedding. Then he tells us the wine ran out, and Jesus' mother come and told them. So there's several things here. One, they're probably kin to or very close friends with this family, because that's how she would have known, Jesus' mother would have known before everybody else would have found out at the whole wedding ceremony. 2, we think, okay, no big deal, the wine ran out, so you run out of some food at something. But it was a very big deal then. This was not just embarrassing, like when you make a goof in front of your friends or something. This was an embarrassment that could have lasted the couple's lifetime, even affecting their children and all, because it was just a major you didn't do. So to us, that wouldn't have been such a big deal, but it really was then. And I know we talked about in class before about that probably by the time Jesus started his public ministry, that Joseph had probably died. And this is one of the keys that probably tell us that he had, because Jesus's mother comes to him first, and without a husband there, she would have gone to the oldest son. So when she comes to Jesus, it's not just because he's the Messiah, it's because he's her oldest son, and so Joseph probably is not there. And let's look at Jesus' response, because this kind of seems strange to us in our day and time too. It says, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." It kind of almost sounds a little disrespectful, but woman, he's actually is a term of endearment, so he's not talking ugly to his mom. And then he tells her, "My hour has not yet come." Think back to even the temptation in the desert. Jesus had fasted for 40 days, and the first one, the devil tries to get him to turn the stone into bread. And if there was any time to use your power, that would have been the time. If you had been fasting for 40 days, we would all have been tempted to turn the stone into bread. But Jesus is showing he's not going to do anything before he knows it's the Father wants him to. So he's telling her, "My hour's not yet come." And his mother says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." And nearby stood these 6 stone water jars. And it says they hold 20 to 30 gallons. So we're talking 120 to 180 gallons and all. And it says for the ceremonial washing. I know we've talked about it before. Remember, the Jews were always very worried about being clean, ceremonial clean, and all. But we need to think about this. What does the wine, when we talk about the Last Supper, what does Jesus tell us it represents? His blood. It's the part of the new covenant. And here he's turning water for ceremonial washing into wine and all. And so it's just pointing us to Jesus' sacrifice, that his body, his blood will be the what will cleanse us. That's more and a more perfect ceremonial wash than the ceremonial washing is. Then Jesus tells the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them to the brim. And this is showing us they're obeying to the fullest, not just a little bit, not putting in just some. They filled it as full as possible, and that's what we're supposed to do, obey to the fullest. Then he tells them to draw it out, take it to the master of the banquet. The master of the banquet, he doesn't know where this come from. The servants do, the disciples do, Jesus does. And he pulls the bridegroom aside because he's like, "This is the better." And here it's showing us, remember, Jesus, God had given them Moses, the 10 Commandments, Abraham. This is what the Jews all looked to. And they thought that's what was going to save them. And while that was all good, it was not as better as what was coming from, like Jesus. So they're showing us what was at first, the wine that they had, it might have been good, but it wasn't the better Jesus that's coming later and all. So then we see, it tells us in verse 11, says, "Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed him." And that's why. The whole book of John, it tells us that he's writing this in order that we may believe. And here we see the disciples start to believe in him. Now we're going to jump ahead, and we'll just pick right back up with verse 13 and read through 22. And this again may be a very familiar story. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all of them out of the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers, and he overturned the tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. And after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. As you read it, I hope it jumped to mind when we see that he's headed to the Jewish Passover. Just a few weeks ago, we talked about Jesus going to the Passover. But remember, that was when he was 12, and he was with his parents, and they found him, when he got lost, they found him in the temple, and he was talking with the leaders. And here again, we see Jesus going to observe the Passover, and he's going to the temple. And it doesn't jump out real obvious to us, but when he tells us that they're in the temple courts, they're selling the cattle, the sheep, and the doves, this is the place for the Gentiles to worship. So they're right in the middle of where the only place the Gentiles can go, and you can imagine if cattle and sheep and people calling out for you to buy stuff, and they're exchanging money, and birds in cages and all are there. It's not a very good worshipful place. There isn't no room for that there. And that's why Jesus is driving them out. Part of this kind of sounds odd to us. It doesn't exactly say that Jesus got angry here, but we can imagine he was that enough to put a whip together and drive these animals out, and to tell the people to stop doing this, overturn the money and everything. And we tend to think of anger and we think, oh, that's a sin. But we know Jesus didn't sin. And so we have to look at this. This is righteous anger. Now, most of the time when we get angry, we're angry because something's been done to us. And we lash out, and in that we sin. And the Bible tells us in Ephesians, it says, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and don't give the devil a foothold. Now, Jesus didn't get angry for himself. He got angry because they were doing against his Father. And that's the only way we can have righteous anger. One of the ways you might see, if you're at school or around friends and someone uses God's name in vain, that drives me crazy and all. And if you get angry, but not because it offended you, but because you know it offends God. But even in getting angry in it and hearing someone takes God's name in vain, we can't lash out. We can't slap them in the face, tell them, hey, stop that, because then we're sinning. Now, you can tell them that that's not the right way to use that and all, but you have to do it in a way that is not where you're not sinning. You can't do it in anger where we're sinning ourselves. And it's not because we're hurt by it. It's when you are hurt the way God would be hurt by sin. That's righteous anger. And that's what we see Jesus with here. And let's see. Oh, the other thing, when they question him by whose authority, we can imagine it's some of the Levites and the priests that are asking him this. It doesn't tell us exactly and all who it was that asked him. But that's the very ones who were supposed to be overseeing God's house and making sure that it was right. And they were not. And in fact, many believe they may have been profiting off of that. And it sounds funny, we're like, why would they be selling there? It wasn't even the act of selling that was wrong, because many people during the Passover, the number of people there would triple. And so many of these people came from very far away, and that would have been a hard journey on some of the animals. Then there was also this, when he says the money changers, they had to pay a temple tax, and you could only use a half shekel. And so they had to change their money out. None of that was wrong. It was just that they shouldn't have been doing it in there, and many were cheating and all the people as they did it. And that was the part that was wrong. Let's see. Then we'll jump ahead and look where they asked him. They asked in verse 18, the Jews responded, and they said, what sign can you show us to prove your authority? Now, we just seen where John pointed out Jesus' first sign, and many times the Jews are asking for a sign, and Jesus did give many signs, but they really weren't open in their eyes to the signs, because later, we didn't read down, but verse 23 through 25, it tells us that he did many signs, and people were starting to believe in Jesus at this. But Jesus gives them kind of a funny answer at the time. Destroy this temple, I'll raise it again in 3 days. And of course, it goes on to tell us that he's not talking about the physical temple. He's talking about his body. But even the disciples, I want you to see, they didn't understand it then. We talked about how it's important for us to memorize scripture. And at the right time, God brings it to mind and helps you to understand. And we see that later when the disciples, after Jesus was crucified and all, that he helped them to understand. So then they remembered that Jesus had done this and said this. Again, I think two of the most important things about today's lessons, in both cases, I want you to remember Jesus' motive was to bring glory and honor to the Father and obey his will. He didn't get mad and angry for himself. He got mad and angry because they were going against his Father and what they were supposed to be doing in his Father's house. And we need to remember Jesus' anger was righteous, directed toward God's glory and the defense of his holy name and place of worship. And our anger is usually driven by selfish desires, not because we're upset with sin against a holy God. But anger isn't sin. It's a God-given emotion that reflects part of his character. So I want you to remember that when we get angry, we need to think, what are we angry at? Are we angry because it's hurt us or it's hurt God? Okay. I hope in the next few weeks we are back together. If not, if you want to look ahead, we will be in probably one of the most famous chapters that y'all all know. I hope again we'll learn something you didn't before. We'll be in chapter 3 where the verse John 3:16 comes from that most all of you know. So I hope to see you again next week.